those school closures were bad. And I remember April of 2020, I was like, I don't know that remote school is going to work. I think we may need to get, and oh my gosh, like the torrent of abuse we got for that. But in reality, I mean, you had to weigh what are you doing in terms of the policy versus what are you losing out on by having the kids doing that. They were wrong about forced masking. The CDC at one point said if you wear masks, COVID would end in 6 weeks. That was in 2020. They said that, and that was not true. They were wrong to deny the existence of natural immunity. That's just a fact of life. When you recover from something like that, you do get protection. And they said no on natural immunity for a long time. Even tried to say that natural immunity is inferior to mRNA vaccines, which was not based in solid data. And the question, though, is why did they do that? And I think the reason that they did that is because the whole infrastructure they were trying to impose on society to control your behavior, the minute you recognize natural immunity, well, then it's like, okay, you had COVID. How could you justify restricting somebody that has natural immunity? And they couldn't, and they knew that they wouldn't have an answer for that. So they just tried to deny natural immunity entirely, and that's really hurt their credibility, I think. Seasonality, I mean, I remember saying 2021, I'm like, COVID, it's a seasonal pattern based on the regions of the country. Sun Belt's different than the Northeast. And DeSantis is just saying this. And then now they've done studies showing the seasonal pattern of it, so people are finally coming on that. mRNA shots. They said if you take these shots, you will not get COVID. Well, we know that's not true. That's definitely not true with these booster shots that they're doing. But that was something that they were doing because there were people who were very low risk for COVID that were being coerced or badgered into doing mRNA. And the reason that we're saying was, okay, yeah, you may be low risk, but this is a way to prevent infection for other people because if you take this, you won't get it or spread it. And that's just not true. They also, from the very beginning, tried to cover up the origins of COVID. They wanted to say that it came from a wet market. And, when that first was said, I didn't really know, right, because maybe that was logical. And they said, well, there happens to be this Wuhan Institute right there, too. And I'm like, okay. It turns out a lot of the reasons I think they were concerned about acknowledging it came from a lab is because our own government had funded gain-of-function research. They're sending money to Wuhan and other places to do things that are very, very risky. So we know, look, it came from a lab, okay? That's where it came from. And I think we need the full accounting of the origins of that. Then you also saw experts really beclown themselves on things like when you had the BLM protests. This is late May of 2020 into early June, somewhere around there. At that point, all these experts were I mean, they're always attacking Florida. If you leave your house, they were saying, you're putting other people at risk. You need to stay home. You shouldn't be out doing things. I mean, I remember in Florida, they were mad that people were out for Memorial Day weekend, all this stuff. But that was with their position. You need to be inside. Well, then you have these protests. You have massive numbers of people out there. And so the question is this okay with COVID, given what you've said? And what they said was, yes, it's actually okay. That protesting, the police are doing whatever they were doing with BLM, that serves a public health function. So even though they've got hundreds or thousands of people together, that was fine. They actually wrote a letter saying this. And in the same letter, they said, it's fine to go out and protest with BLM, but does not mean it's okay for you to protest against lockdowns or other things that you may. So, this was presumably a woke virus. But I think But I think that really took the mask off a lot of these people because clearly it's absurd that you would take that position from a scientific perspective. And so that was really showing that this is more about them advancing an agenda and about exerting control. And that's something that's very, very dangerous. And I don't even think we've fully gotten over a lot of what's been done here 3 years later. They also, these experts resorted to, because at that time there was like no dissent allowed basically. I mean, that they had the narrative, particularly in those first couple months. And if you had people that tried to speak out, they faced really, really significant blowback. I mean, you had people like Fauci saying we need to take down some of these other scientists like Bhattacharya from Stanford. You actually had the federal government colluding with big tech to stifle dissent when it came to COVID lockdowns, COVID masking, school closures, all those other things. And so that's really, really significant abuse of power, and yet that happened in our country. And so here we are 3 years later. As I mentioned, they're still clinging to failed policies. I mean, you have Novak Djokovic, tennis player. We wanted him to come for the Miami Open, is one of the biggest events of the year. And he made the decision he wasn't going to take the MNRA shot. Now, this guy's in great shape. He wasn't at risk for COVID in any significant way. Didn't know what MNRA would mean for him, so he just said, I'm not doing it. Why is that an unreasonable thing to have said? I mean, that's totally normal. And yet, they have we're one of the few countries in the world that is clinging to the idea that you have to show proof of shot to come into our country via a plane. And so that's caused him that. Now, I wrote a letter to President Biden asking him to reverse this, that it's ridiculous. We think that there may be a little loophole in that thing for boats. So I did say, I mean, look, I will have a boat at the Bahamas. We can bring him over. I would have done that. And they didn't want to do that. I get it because it is what it is. But just how absurd is this? And oh, by the way, not only is it absurd to say that he can't come unless he shows the shot, he's had COVID before. So he definitely has protection from COVID. So these people coming are not posing a risk to the public in any significant way. Federal mask mandate on airplanes. So we had a challenge in Florida. Federal district judge struck down the mask mandate for airlines. And just think how miserable it was being on the airlines. It was causing a lot of problems. It was not working. And, these little kids, like they would get, a 2-year-old kid, you got to force the mask. I mean, it's hard enough to keep the kids behaving on the plane as it is, much less having to force a mask. And yet that was what it was. So it was really, I think, some ugly stuff. So it was struck down, thankfully, and really liberated the country from this. And Biden's administration is arguing in court now to reimpose the mask mandate on air travel, for commercial air travel. I mean, you can't make this up. 3 years later, they want that mandate to be reinstated. And then even just this week, you have the FDA approving bivalent booster shots for babies. So now you're such a 6-month-old baby, you do the first round and then 2 booster. That's like 4 shots of MNRA relatively early in your life. And Joe can talk a little bit more about this, but what's the evidence that this is helping these babies? There is none. I mean, the data they used to get this approved through FDA was very, very sparse. And so you're in this situation where they're pursuing an agenda. They're not doing what the evidence is saying. So Florida, I think, we played an important role over the last 3 years. I think we were one of the first states to see that the experts were getting it wrong, and we resolved to chart a different course. We were not going to let this state descend into a Faucian dystopia, not on our watch. And so we took a lot of different actions to make sure that we could liberate the state from Fauciism. And you're going to hear from people, I mean, we saved countless jobs in the state of Florida because of our actions. We kept many, many businesses alive, and a lot of the businesses that, probably would have failed if we had policies of other states. Not only did they not fail, a lot of them are doing better than ever in Florida. And so we're really happy to see that. We also rescued kids from being plunged into perpetual isolation. We forced the schools in 2020 to be open for all Florida students. We thought that was something that was important. That was not something that was popular with a lot of the experts. It was certainly not popular with legacy media. We were even sued by the school unions. They wanted to close the schools, and so we won that case in court. But we were looking at a situation where, we were out in front on this. We were taking a lot of incoming. Now, 3 years later, people look back, and a lot of people don't even admit that they opposed us on it, but people are acknowledging the devastating consequences when you had kids locked out of school for a year in some of these other states. Total disaster in terms of their well-being, academic ability, and everything down the line. So that was something that was really important. You know, we never did a mask mandate in the state of Florida, and then when local governments were doing it, we came in and said, you know, you're not allowed to enforce. So I used my clemency powers to say no fines or no anything, and anybody that had been fined or anything with COVID restrictions from local government, we remitted that and basically pardoned everybody, which I think was really, really important. We also banned vaccine passports in the state of Florida. We didn't want to be in a situation where people had to show shot records to be able to participate in daily life. When people were threatened with losing their jobs, we called a special session of the legislature to prevent jab or job mandates. You shouldn't have to choose between a job you need and a shot that you don't want. And the thing about the jab mandates, this was after we got into the summer of 2021 when you had massive waves. You had all these people that got the shots, massive numbers of shots done, and it should never have, if they were working as promised, you would never have had a major wave. Yet people were getting infected, and we started to see that. So as the efficacy of it was coming into question, that's when they wanted to do even more coercion against people. That should tell you, I mean, that was a huge red flag to see them. Of course, Biden wanted to do the national mandate where, you know, you're a truck driver or something, you could lose your job if you didn't want to get this. They tried to do the same with law enforcement and nurses and all these other things. So we stood up against that. But then also because we've seen so many promises and statements about this, and yes, in Florida we came in and stopped the coercion, but there was still a lot of pressure put on people to do the jabs. We are the first state to investigate these misrepresentations, and so we actually currently have a grand jury impaneled in the state of Florida to be looking into everything surrounding the COVID jabs. And we created, because the CDC for really the last 3 years has whiffed on so many different things when it came to this, and it's like now they put something out and you just dismiss it because of some of the stuff that they were trying to do throughout the pandemic.